Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Today, Corey is here with me and we are talking about when your extended family is not on board with peaceful parenting, which comes up so much. Welcome, Corey.
Hi, I'm happy to be here again.
Yeah, so it's always great to have these conversations. I mean, I know for both of us in our coaching and in our communities, both in our membership and then also in our big Facebook group, this comes up so much when people, either their parents or their brother or like whoever is openly criticizing their parenting, like you're going to let them get away with that, or you've really got to do something about this. Or when people can just tell that their parents or their siblings or whoever are, they're not saying anything, but they can tell that they're judging them. And so just people are always wanting to know, like, what should I do? And I think it's really hard because it can bring up so much shame in us, right? When we feel this disapproval from the people that we love. And a lot of us are like recovering people pleasers. And then we're caught between what we want and what we think they think. So is that something you see a lot too?
Yes, this comes up so much. I think it's actually come up even more in the membership than in my one-on-one clients. It's just a reoccurring theme because, especially at this time of year, everyone's getting worried about when they spend extended periods of time with their families. And that's when it's almost the anticipation of these moments starts to get more intense.
Yeah. And I think, and when I was just talking and I was saying like either they're openly criticizing them or they're not saying anything, if your people are not saying anything, maybe just leave it. Right? Like give yourself some compassion, even if you can feel that you're being judged. If nobody's saying anything, just let it, I would say just let it go. Like if they're not actually saying anything, you don't have to bring it up either. And it seems like they're probably thinking we'll agree to disagree kind of thing. And that's probably pretty healthy.
Yeah, it's much harder and more interesting when people are outright criticizing you.
Yeah.
And this is where my favorite line you've ever told me before always comes into play. And the first thing you need to do is remind yourself that your loyalty lies with your child.
Yeah.
I think it can be so hard if someone's outright criticizing you. You might have an instinct to just start doing whatever your family is telling you to do.
Mm-hmm.
You might all of a sudden just be acting totally out of your normal way and find yourself dropping peaceful parenting because you just want to do what is expected of you in that sort of shame-fueled moment. So that's when it's like, let's just stop, drop and breathe,
Mm-hmm.
and remind yourself that the relationship that's most important here is the one with your child and not with any other family member.
Yeah, I think that stop, drop, and breathe pause button will be used a lot in the coming like family gatherings. And I love that you said that because I think it's partly, especially if we were raised with more authoritarian parenting, we're used to like obeying our parents, right? Or there's that at least that residue, like that leftover residue. And especially if your parents use love withdrawal as a tactic to get you to cooperate. And if anyone doesn't know what I mean by that, it's like, the silent treatment or just in some way your parents made you know that they were unhappy with you when you did something that they didn't like. And so that can be really triggering. Like that can be super triggering, like back to our own childhood and like our inner child. So maybe like just a moment to shout out too, like speak to your inner child when that's happening. Like if you can feel that disapproval of your parents, give a little love to your inner child who experienced that and just some compassion. Like, I'm sorry that you experienced that when you were little. Like, it's different now. You don't have to, you're safe, right? You're safe even if you're getting that love withdrawal. And I think as kids, we didn't feel safe if we got that love withdrawal.
Yeah, that's so true. When you say love withdrawal, that instantly makes me think of when parents say, I'm not angry, I'm disappointed.
Right. I'm disappointed. As if
right?
it's any better, and then it's worse, right?
Yes, that's, that feeling of like, I'm disappointed in you. Like,
Yeah.
that's what it can feel like, even as an adult with your child in that situation.
Yeah, totally. Well, when we were talking about sort of preparing for this episode, I sort of mentioned that I think there's 2 phases of it, right? There's like the first phase, let's assume that they just don't understand peaceful parenting, right? And they don't know what it's about, and there could be like an education piece, and then they're like, "Oh, okay, I get it. That makes a lot of sense." Like I actually remember one of our members, Lauren, was talking about her parents had signed up for the summit because they really wanted to understand like this, peaceful parenting thing that she was doing, and she was so thrilled because she felt like that was going to really help them understand her and her parenting more. So there's that like phase 1, like, maybe they're criticizing it because they don't understand it. And then we can talk about sort of some different strategies if you're in phase 1, but then there might be phase 2 where they do know what you're doing, but they just don't agree with it. And they, and that might be a different phase. So in phase 1, like in that education piece, I think one thing that can be really helpful is to help them understand how the advances in brain science and the nervous system, like how we understand the nervous system and how the brain works, and maybe even like send them. I know you had mentioned to me before that you thought to send them the article about what is peaceful parenting, which I think is great. And we'll link to that in the show notes for anyone who doesn't know that article that I wrote about, it just explains the big ideas of peaceful parenting. And I think even further than that, to share the science, right? Like maybe, if they'd be willing to listen to a podcast, there's the podcast I did with Stuart Shanker, which was one of my all-time favorite ones, talking
Yes.
about how misbehavior is stressed behavior. And he's a scientist who's talking about, this is why kids misbehave and this is what's going on. So I don't know, are there any other education pieces that you can think of that would be helpful if they're sort of in that first phase?
Yeah, I think it's so fantastic that Lauren's parents did the summit. I got my parents to do it this year too. And my parents are used to me educating them about this. We've been talking about it for years, but even they found my mom was blown away by your workshop, by the way.
Oh,
So
good.
shout out to my mom if she's listening. She loved your workshop. There's those kinds of things can be really great where it's immersive over a couple of days. But if your parents or family members don't have the bandwidth for that, would they be willing to sign up for your newsletter?
Yeah.
Like, because that's such a great little quick reflection that comes once a week that you can
Mhm.
just kind of read on your own away from someone else telling you what to learn about. I love that. I know someone who gave their partner, one of my clients, an audiobook to listen to. That was one of our favorite peaceful parenting books, to just listen to it on their own and digest it. So if a parent has an Audible subscription or
Yeah.
is open to something like that, that might be a good way too.
Yeah, self-reg I think is a great one too, just to really understand like say you have a kid who has, they're still learning, they're still developing their impulse control, the brain development, and still learning emotional regulation, and your parents might be like, you've got to do something about that when your kid's like lying on the floor crying or whatever. It's maybe just helping them understand that piece of like the nervous system. I mean, maybe there are some parents who would listen to a whole book, but maybe just finding like a choice article. We'll link to a couple articles in the show notes that people can share with parents or loved ones who are, not don't understand that the relationship between the nervous system and brain, etc. So yeah, and I think just I love how you said to me earlier, just to set that limit when you are going to be visiting, just like this is what we're doing and it's not up for discussion. How do you think you would put that?
So I love this line. I think you got it from one of your clients a long time ago, but she said it with such graciousness that I think it would really put, any parent at ease. And that's coming from the angle of being like, look, you worked so hard as a parent. And, I'm so thankful for, you've been there for me, but I just want you to enjoy your grandchildren when you're around them. So, if anything's going wrong or you're having any problems, come get me. I can take care of that part. And I just want you to have the enjoying your grandchildren part.
Yes, I love that. So it's kind of like it's it's a nice way of saying, is saying stay out of it, wrapped up in a
Yes.
bow of we're just giving you this gift of, you just get to enjoy them and you don't need to worry about the, quote discipline. I love that. And I think just, I think maybe having a pat line too, where if you do get a criticism coming your way or you do get a comment coming your way, what I love to say is, what's so funny is I had a client once who, when I told him something he wasn't super thrilled about hearing. He said this to me, and I said, "Did you get that from me?" He's like, "Maybe." But he said, and this is what I suggest that people say, which is, "I'll take that into consideration." Because that's kind of a conversation ender, right? It's like, I'll take that into consideration is not saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's also not saying, I will do what you're asking me to do. But I think it's a pretty thoughtful way of kind of saying, like, this is not up for discussion. I'll take that into consideration, and maybe even add something to soften it a little bit, like, thank you so much for your concern. I know it's coming from a place of really deep love, and I'll take that into consideration.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think the thing here too is you need to have confidence. And I think that might be something that is sometimes really hard when you're early on in your peaceful parenting journey. So this is going to be a big ask for people who are new to this or have really little kids. But I think as you get doing this, you do develop a confidence because you see the relationship you're having with your children, and it doesn't feel, you're kind of, I don't know, you just have faith in what you're doing. And so you need to bring that to
Yes.
people and really have that, I've got this.
Yes.
If you seem like I don't know what I'm doing, then people are kind of like sneaking in there and kind of making you feel more self-conscious about the whole thing. So I
Yeah.
think it's just really being confident in what you know to be true, and that this connection with your kid is the most important thing.
Yes, and 2 things off of that, just I love that you brought that up. One thing I think is that we need to remember that often when kids aren't afraid of adults, there was that great article by Melinda Wenner, what's her name? Melinda, ah,
Wenner Moyer
Wenner Moyer, yeah.
or
Uh,
Moyer Wenner.
the science journalist who wrote the book
Yes.
How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Blankety Blanks. I love that article that she wrote for the New York Times, which was that it might be actually a little bit of a good thing if your kids are a little bit rude, because it shows that they're not afraid of adults, right? Or they're not afraid of you, and that they're not afraid to express their opinion. They're not afraid to show their feelings. And so I think, reminding ourselves of that too, when we are in the situation where we feel like we're underneath a magnifying glass and everyone's judging us, and our kids, maybe we're even there with a sibling and their kids are like, quote, perfectly behaved and, quote, polite, and our kids are like falling apart. And so maybe just reminding ourselves that we don't know why those kids are perfectly behaved, and maybe they're afraid of what's going to happen if they're not, right? And maybe our kids are not afraid of what's going to happen if they're not. So I think there's that piece where sometimes, sometimes peaceful parenting, quote, works right away, and you get a lot better behavior and things get a lot easier. But then, as we both know, with some of our families who have more complex kids, it's not that their brains really need to mature, and we really need to see a lot of, like, over time things will get easier as they get older, but there's a lot of messiness in those earlier years. So I think just reminding yourself of that, and it doesn't mean just because your brother's kids are sitting perfectly at the table and yours are not, it doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. So
Yes.
long-winded way of saying that. And then also I think that, bringing along with that self-confidence is bringing that self-compassion of I'm worthy and lovable, even though everyone's judging my parenting, or even though my kid is melting down at Christmas morning because he didn't get the present that he wanted, or whatever the thing is. So just bringing that self compassion along with the self confidence. So I think that's something to keep in mind too.
Yes, the self-compassion is so important. And I think that's that inner child work that's going to come up. This is, like you said at the beginning, this is what's so hard about this situation is it's not just anybody criticizing you, it's your parents,
Hmm.
right? Or your brother, or extended family, or grandma. So like that's when you just really need the self-compassion, because it's so easy to get like taken over by the shame when it's
Yeah.
close family members.
Yeah. And this is a little bit of a sidebar, but like, say you are visiting, visiting people over the holidays, or they're visiting you. This isn't exactly like what to do when they're not on board, but if they're not on board, it might be necessary to build in some breaks just to like give everybody a little bit of breathing room so that you're not together all the time. So that, and also I think a lot of times our parents want to see us, right? And I know it can be hard sometimes with little kids around to feel like you're getting a good adult visit. So maybe plan to go out to lunch with your parents, or have some time where you're taking the kids out of the house if you're visiting them. Just a little bit of a sidebar, because I think that tensions, if there's some differences in opinion about parenting, tensions can tend to be a little bit higher.
Okay, that is such a good point, because that brings us to the most important thing, which is that all relationships are about peaceful parenting,
Yes.
right? So basically it's relationship principles, and they apply to everyone equally, that you need to regulate yourself when you're with people, you need to be empathy, and you need to have kind firm limits.
Mhm.
And so, that's such a great idea of making sure that you're connecting with these people that you might not be agreeing with, can make it so much easier for everyone to agree to disagree, right?
Yes.
If you're not just all heightened, if you are regulated, and if you are, going out for lunch and feeling that bond that brings you together.
Yeah, totally. So another thing that I just thought of that comes up, and I know I've had at least a couple of clients talk to me about this, is that their parents, their own parents, go into mama or papa bear mode when they feel like the grandchildren are giving the parents a hard time. If you can see the generations that I'm trying to refer to there, but like the
Yes.
grandparents see the grandchildren quote acting out, and then they become protective of their own kids. And so I think if you see that happening, just maybe taking your parent aside and saying, look, I really appreciate the concern and love that you're showing for me. So again, this is that, as you say, all relationships are rooted in the peaceful parenting approach. This is that leading with empathy, right? So before you have to make a correction with somebody, always lead with empathy. So if you want your parent to stop yelling at your kid because your kid is yelling at you, take them aside and say, listen, I really, really appreciate your concern. I can see how much love it comes from. And at the same time, because we never say but, because but erases all of the empathy that we just gave. And at the same time, I can handle this. And, I've got this under control and I have a plan. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah, that's so important. And a sidebar that everyone needs to hear is, I've used that method of talking so much around my children that now they'll pipe in before I even start and say, at the same time.
That's awesome.
So you can train yourself to reword things a certain way. But yes, that's becoming a running joke in my house, the at
That's
the
so
same
funny.
time.
Yeah, but is a bad word. And for more, but with two T's and with one T, no.
That's right.
And, I was also just thinking about something that Tasha recommends. Tasha Shore, who's our friend who talks about aggression. She says that a lot of times when people are, in public, or like they go to a friend's house, or your parents or whatever, and you're trying to help your child who has some tendencies to be aggressive, she said front load it. I don't know if that's the word she used, but tell people right off the bat, listen, we've been having a little bit of, say your kid's been hitting a lot or something. Right off the bat, tell everyone, we've been having a little bit of trouble with hitting. So if you see that happening, just know that we've got a plan and this is something that we're working on. So that I think does two things. One is it makes you not feel so self-conscious because people will be like, "Oh, here's that thing again that she told us about," right? So
Yes.
it helps you not to feel that sort of shame and self-consciousness in the moment. And also it will, I think, like cut off at the pass any criticisms, because if you haven't said anything and your parent witnesses your child hit you, of course they're going to say something. They're going to want to say something, right? But if they see that and they're like, "Oh, this is the thing that they said they were working on," they might not say anything.
Yeah, that's such a good line. That's such a good way to go about it. It's also the confidence that they don't need to panic. You have a plan and you're handling it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything that we didn't include when we wanted to talk about that sort of education piece and what to say to them. I think we've pretty much covered it. Oh, one thing that you had brought up earlier that we haven't talked about yet is the modeling piece. Just really remember that just like when we have a partner who might not be on board with peaceful parenting, the most important, not the most important, one of the most important things is to model the peaceful parenting approach. And I think that's the same thing with our extended family. And over time, hopefully they'll see how that works. I know you've heard this story before, and I don't know if I've told this on the podcast, but I had a family member who I could tell was not impressed with our parenting in the early years. They disagreed with a lot of choices that we made and how we were doing things. And about, I want to say, 8 years in, when my kids were maybe like, you know, maybe they were like 9, 6, and 3 or something like that, this person took me aside and said, had a lot of doubts about how you and your partner were raising the kids, but now I can see that you really knew what you were doing because they're just so wonderful. So it can take some time for that modeling piece to have the desired effect of people being able to see what you're doing. But really trust me that it does people do see it after a while, as that maturation process is happening, they do see it.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, I think the last thing we were going to talk about during phase one is the whole idea of boundaries.
Well, I think, you know what, I think boundaries might be a phase 2 thing.
Yeah, you
Like,
think? Okay.
yeah, just because I think phase 1 education, and then if they don't follow what you're asking them to do, not get involved in maybe it's got a little foot in both area in both stages.
Yes,
But I
yes.
think that if you have done your part of trying to educate about what you're trying to do with peaceful parenting, and you're getting your extended family is not, either they are continuing to talk to you about it and criticize you after you've made it clear that that's not open for a conversation, or they're outwardly going against, what you've asked them to do. I think that's when we bring in boundaries.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So why don't you, yeah, I know you've done a lot of reading about boundaries. So why don't you explain what a boundary is? Because I think sometimes it can be confusing.
Okay, so my big boundary resource I'm going to describe for is Nedra Glover Tawwab's book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And she also has a workbook, which I also have. And her workbook is also wonderful.
If you're not watching this on YouTube, Corey's holding up the books she's got right in her study there.
Just full of tabs, with all the best parts. But so basically, a boundary is everyone thinks that a request is a boundary when you tell someone what you do or do not want them to do. But a boundary is actually about saying the request and then actually saying what you're going to do about that. So people know it's really more about what you are going to
Yeah.
be doing than what anyone else is going to be doing.
I
So,
I read this great example that really stuck in my mind, is really explaining it well, which is, say you have a friend that's always late to meet you for lunch. The boundary would not be, the boundary would not be, I want you to be on time for lunch. That's not the boundary. The boundary is, if you're not there within 10 minutes after the time we've agreed to meet, I'm leaving. Like, that would be the boundary, right? So it's like
yes, yes.
what you are going to do. Like, you can't, because we can't control other people. Like, I mean, maybe that's obvious, and maybe we should have said it at the top of the episode here, or the conversation, but we can't control how our extended family acts or what they do or what they think. All we can control is ourselves.
Yes. I think what I really love too about Nedra's work is she talks a lot about when you're setting boundaries, it's going to feel bad. It almost always feels bad, but you
Say
need
more
to
about
learn.
that.
Well, she said you're almost always going to feel guilty, right? Because you're telling someone that their behavior is technically not okay and this is what you're going to do if they do that. So it can feel uncomfortable and like those kind of conversations, especially people pleasers don't want to have. And she's like, you need to learn to tolerate those feelings.
Mm.
Just like you've learned to tolerate feeling excited on exciting days, you can learn to tolerate feeling guilty or uncomfortable when you're setting boundaries. And she said the most important thing you need to do is you need to enforce them right away every time. So, in our example earlier, where you said essentially it was a boundary, the really nice way that we talked about being like, I'm going to handle discipline. I just want you to enjoy your grandparents. You need to act on that every time. So, if they start disciplining your children in a way you're not comfortable with, yelling at them time out or anything like that, you would come in and be like, thank you so much for trying to help me with this, but I've got this.
Hmm.
And then, kind of go in and take over handling that moment. So that's what she would say, is just you have to make sure you follow through with those boundaries so that they're not getting a mixed message of like, oh, you say you're not going to handle it, but it's okay if I do. You're like, nope, if you start doing it, I'm always going to come in.
Right. I love just let me just go back to the beginning of what you said, that it feels uncomfortable and then it's okay to sit with that. So, I think that's really useful, because I think that for a lot of people, at least at first, they are going to feel guilty, or like they're being mean, or that, like, feel really uncomfortable. But I think the point here is, like, you can feel that way and do it anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes. Nedra
useful.
talks about feeling mean throughout the entire book.
Yeah.
I'm doing like a promotion of the book right now, basically. But that's how we feel, because we're taught to be polite and kind and we feel like we're not, but we actually are, because by putting these practices in place and learning to sit with that discomfort, but doing it anyways, you're actually building a better relationship with your family because you're
Hmm.
finding a way to make that relationship work.
Yeah, and you can be kind, right? Like, you can, like,
Yes.
that's, I mean, again, our peaceful parenting, kind, firm limits, right? Is, I had a client who, when they were sending their child over to grandparents for sleepover who was getting spanked when they found they didn't know that and then send the child. They found that out afterwards, and they had to set a boundary. You can't have unsupervised time with our child unless you can,
Yes.
guarantee me that you won't lay a hand on our child, right? And I think it took a couple of months because the parents were kind of upset about it at first, the grandparents, and then they finally said, "Okay, we won't do that." But yeah, I mean, that's a fairly extreme example that I think most people who listen to this podcast at least would not have trouble setting that kind of boundary, that, your child's not going to be hit by their grandparents. But I think there are, it's a continuum. Like, what
Yes.
there are going to be like little things that make you uncomfortable that maybe you can let go of. I've had people who ask me like, well, what if the grandparents are always saying like, if you're a good girl, then you get, an extra treat, or, things like that kind of make them cringe. I don't know. And I'm curious to hear what you think about that, because my personal take on those borderline things is that we can let some of that stuff go. That, you can have a talk afterwards with your kid about, isn't it interesting that grandma and grandpa talk about good girls and bad girls? Like, I don't really think that there are good girls and bad girls. I think they're just, some kids who are, having a hard time, or whatever, whatever you want to say. You can talk
Yes.
about it, right? You can talk about it.
Yes.
This is not quite the same thing, but I remember somebody that I used to work with who their father said their son had like a pink bag, and their father said like, pink isn't for boys. And they talked to their child afterwards and just said, grandpa grew up at a time where that was something that, boys weren't allowed to have pink, or they got made fun of or whatever. And they just used it as a sort of a learning opportunity. So I think some things you can really just let it go, right? So I think that there's that whole idea of, you have to decide what you can let go of and what is just more important, too important for you to let go of, right?
I think that's so important because it can get into a power struggle situation with your extended family. If you decide you're just going to like it's my way or the highway, that's not going to build that relationship. And if that relationship matters to you, then I think it's okay to let some of those minor things go. And only you can decide what that is.
Hmm.
We asked our membership, for some examples of questions they had, and a couple times food came up, and I found that interesting because food is something that comes up so much when you're with families, and food is so emotional
Hmm.
because it can be tied to culture and traditions and all sorts of things, and people have so many different ideas about food. So I think in a lot of cases I'm okay letting food stuff go when I'm with extended family. And like you said, just having a debrief with your kids afterwards if you have different views about it. Or I let my kids have, I don't have rules about, you do this and then you get this food. But that seems to be like in a lot of conventional parenting and comes up a lot with the families that we work with.
Hmm.
So I think as long as you tell your kids afterwards, I do think that's the important part though, is kids do notice it, and they're going to notice if you don't talk about it.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and I think you can use it as like a learning tool also, right? Because ultimately we want our kids to be critical thinkers, and that doesn't happen with being wrapped in bubble wrap and, blinders and earmuffs, right? They like learn to be critical thinkers through being exposed to different ideas and developing their own ideas about that and their own thoughts about that. So, I do think also that we have to remember that we are our parents, like the main parents or caregivers, are the most important influence on the kids, unless, your parents are your daily caregivers, right? But most of us live in a situation where grandparents are going to be more a peripheral and not like that daily presence and influence. So I think really just like being able to let some stuff go, like let some of the smaller things go, is really a good idea.
Yeah, so much so. And I like the idea too of us always wanting to be critical thinkers ourselves. And you and I talk a lot lately about how we've changed our minds about all sorts of things.
Hmm.
So being open to the fact and talking to our kids about, well, what do we think about that? And not just because something our extended family thinks is different than us. Maybe we should actually consider it. Doesn't mean we have to be swayed easily, but I think it's good to just have that feeling of truly being open to other ideas too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's hard, I think, as our culture has gotten more and more polarized. polarized,
Yes.
it can be really hard to remember that you can love somebody that you don't agree with, right? Or you can
Yes.
not agree with somebody that you love. And I know I have a branch of my husband's family that there are just certain things that we do not talk about, right? And I do love them and I think they're good people. But it would be like if certain things came up in conversation, it would be really, really awful. So I think that can be okay too, is just to focus on the connection piece. And, and I guess if you did have really big, important differences, that would be that your extended family refuses to honor that you believe differently about something and they're still saying like homophobic things in front of your kids or something like that. That would be a boundary that I would draw.
Yes. I
Yeah.
think what's really helpful is you know what your extended family is like, you know what some of those tension areas are. So going ahead and writing some of them down ahead of time and knowing which are the ones that I need to say something and what can I let go. And I think that can let you go to that situation a lot more relaxed because you don't feel like you have to fight every battle. You know what the things are, you're dropping the demands.
Yeah.
And we've learned so much from Amanda Diekman, it's proactively dropping the demands, dropping the need to fight about everything and really honing in on what are the things that are non-negotiable that I need to enforce with my family with boundaries, and what are the things that I'm ahead of time knowing I'm just going to let it be.
Yeah. I know when my kids visited their grandparents, especially my dad, they ate so much sugar. Like, I remember once my son, Asa, my middle son, was visiting by himself. Was one thing my parents did that was nice was they would like take the kids on their own for visits occasionally, which was nice when you have 3 kids to just have like
Yes.
a little bit of solo time. But I remember Asa calling me once and he was maybe 7 or 8 and called me and he said, "Guess what I had for breakfast? Oatmeal with ice cream on it." Like, okay. So, there are times where I think we just like, they're going to watch more screen. They're going to, especially if you're not there, right? They're going to eat more sugar. They're
Yes.
going to watch more screen. And I mean, we can just kind of let some of that stuff go.
Yes.
In my opinion, maybe for some people who are listening, that would be something that wouldn't be negotiable for them. But I guess I would encourage people to make sure that not every single thing is a non-negotiable, or it's going to be
That's
really,
right.
really hard to get along with someone.
Yes, that then you barely have a real relationship.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Which I guess brings us to the final point, which is there are some times when a relationship is poor enough and you might have somebody who's struggling with mental health or addiction or, has some sort of limitations in that way, or it was like an actually really truly toxic person where you might just want to really limit your time with them. And maybe even if it's a parent, maybe see them on your own without the kids, because that I think is sort of our last resort. And I know sometimes that is that ultimate boundary that people do really need to draw at some point if they are experiencing, they've tried all of the things that we've said and it's still no go.
And if that is you, the next book on your list is going to be Nedra's other book, which is Family Drama.
Oh, okay, I didn't know about that one.
Yes, so that's a good one too, and it's all about those borderline cases when things are really hard. So that's my next recommendation for families. If things are really hard and you need more than just boundaries, that's a really helpful book.
All right, good. Well, I think hopefully we've given all of our people some good ideas and some strategies for going into this time of year where we do spend a lot more time with family. And yeah, I hope that maybe they'll join our Facebook group, which is Peaceful Parenting with Sarah Rosensweet, and let us know how it went and what they thought of this episode. And also, I want to remind everyone to please share this with a friend. That is the way that we get to reach more families. Leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts, rate and review us on Spotify. It really, really helps the algorithm for us to get found. Word of mouth is the best way for us to reach new people. So thank you so much, Corey.
Thanks for having me.
Now we're going to go back to our families. You heard me before we started recording. My daughter and I are going to make a cake. And I don't know, I bet you're going to go make dinner.
Yes, I am.
We're going to have cake for dinner, apparently, but it's apple cake. So,
Okay, well, you're living your best life. I wish I was
all right.
there.
Thanks, Corey. And see everyone
Bye.
next time on the next episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.